Bonjour.
Hello. Today I am here to present something that I've never really worked on, which is part of my research field, as Christian has just explained. Troin is a district in the north of Naples. It's one of the most stigmatized districts in Italy. It's stigmatized for the levels of crime. First, I'm going to do a little archaeology of the location to explain what Scampia is. Not so much what it is in its essence, but what it is in the process as a developing district. As you can see, the district began to develop from 1962, i.e. from the period in Italy where there was a whole series of subsidies to build social housing. And basically the city of Naples had a series of plans which from 1936 until 1960, they formulated more or less 5 plans for city expansion, but the concerns were always the same. The city of Naples is surrounded by the sea on the one side and small hills which enclose the whole historic center of Naples. So the city was asking itself how they could develop the city, because typical traditional development was not possible. So we can see there was the law to subsidize social housing. The city of Naples decided where to locate the new district, working class districts. So in 1963 we are. The city of Naples decided to locate 2 zones. These were expansion zones. They had to decide whether to do it in the center near the port or whether to have a residential expansion zone in the north. What happened was that they decided to situate near the industrial expansion zone near the port and the residences, the working class residential areas in the north. So there were hills between the two, so before there were no buses, no metro until the end of the 1930s. So in fact, in order to reach the center of the city, people had to travel for about an hour and a half on public transport, which didn't really work at the time. What happened when they started to populate the districts? Between 1970 and 1980, there was the construction of the district. So during the period, the last phase of the building of the district, there was the earthquake, which had enormous destruction, which was on the 23rd of November 1980. This earthquake completely destroyed a part of the historic center of Naples and all the villages around, particularly in the north. And what happened? There were perhaps 1 million people without homes, and then they had to add the people who were already homeless. So what did they do? At the same period, there was a whole huge district which was completely empty. There were only apartment buildings which were already on the social housing market, and the others were completely empty or being built. So therefore, the homeless decided to move into the new districts under construction. So this was the images of, these are pictures from the period. We can see buildings under construction and a few buildings already finished. And in fact, this is the dimensions on the top. You can see the real dimensions of the district, which there are now 70,000 people living there, even though statistics talk of 35,000. So they began to live in that district, to occupy it, to be specific. And this generated a definitive break with a vision of the city. They had invested the imaginary of the city. It made it a very symbolic space. It was supposed to represent a sort of avant-garde of the city of Naples. It was supposed to be an opening point in the city for people who arrived from the north, but it was also supposed to establish a link with the region of Naples and towards the historical center. So this break, this rupture, began the process of the stigmatization of this district, which is now at an incredible level. It's become the cursed district. And the image most often associated with this district is the one you can see at the top right. In all three images, which are the most used in the media, we can see there is one particular building. In fact, it's a symbolic building of this district, which is called les Vele de Scampia, the veils of Scampia. Originally, there were supposed to be 7 enormous 14-story high veils placed at the bottom part of the district. And they occupy more or less 2 enormous blocks. And now they've tried to demolish the veils. So in June this year, they're going to knock down 3 of the 4 veils, as they are called, and the other 2 were demolished some time ago. What I wanted to emphasize was that a part of the rhetoric of stigma that is adopted to talk about this district, where people talk about a cursed district. It's true, it was the greatest pleasure of all the journalists, because whenever anything happens in Scampia, they can put it on the front page of the newspapers. But in particular, what I want to talk about today, there's a rhetoric that the people who live there want to leave. I find this interesting because on my terrain, I didn't see this dynamic. What I saw was people actually populating the district, people moving into the district. I'm talking about the people I spoke to. I don't pretend to represent the district. I'm just talking about the people that I personally spoke to. So I asked myself the question, how is this territory somewhere where people really don't want to live? Is it possible to find residential strategies? I don't know if residential strategy is the right word, but that is the kind of standard term. In fact, I asked myself the question, I saw new inhabitants arrive, I understood somewhat the processes whereby people become inhabitants, how people take possession of a house or apartment, and I also saw that the choice of living in the district could generate a whole series of dynamics which were linked, in fact, with the idea a wider living strategy. The choice of living in this district, it's a complex choice. It's a whole process, a very long process to decide to live there. But this choice determines the possibility, for some families, of belonging to the middle classes, of moving from a status of poor people to the middle classes. In other words, it leads to a whole series of things which otherwise they might not consider possible. So in order to understand what I want to tell you, you have to know the mechanisms of obtaining social housing. Obviously, this is a working class district, so the social housing, there are quite rigid procedures to become a tenant in order to obtain apartments. So there is a procedure which consists of an application made to the appropriate institutions, the social housing institutions. There's a waiting list, a huge waiting list, particularly in Naples, which can last as long as 10 years. And if you have no children, or if you're not a family, it's almost impossible to obtain social housing. So large families have priority. So in general, in Naples, families are quite large, but if you are on your own, you can end up homeless. So what I want to tell you is what happens. There's a whole procedure which actually happens, which is not at all the same. And it's not an institutional procedure, but it is still used by institutions. Who are the actors in this process? You have the new tenants, the people who want to obtain an apartment, the former tenant, i.e. the person who is leaving the apartment, the financial assistance center, the CAF in Italian, which is responsible for providing financial assistance for all the documents, etc. And then there is the institution that manages the social housing. And here there's a whole dynamic that has developed, which I didn't understand, because I spent my first 5 months where I saw families, whole families living in a single building. And I wondered how it was possible to have so much luck with this, with the planned procedure, how they managed, how the sons of sons, the parents of the sons managed to live in the same building. They were really lucky. And that's what I thought for 5 months. And nobody answered, because in fact there was a whole mechanism that they didn't really want to unveil. But I have to say that in the last 2 months this procedure has completely blown up, and it's caused quite a lot of problems to Naples City Council. So what happens is a procedure that takes about 5 years. There's a former tenant who decides to sell his apartment on a black market. It's not that he's selling the apartment, he's selling the possibility of having a subsidized rent, which is between 50 and 100 euros for one's whole life. So what people are buying is a sort of possibility, a lifelong possibility of a low rent. And this forms a kind of asset, because apartments are passed from one individual to another. So it's a sort of asset which is sort of owned by tenants. So the former tenant puts the apartment on the market. The prices that I've been able to see is between 30,000 euros and 55,000 euros. We're talking about apartments which can be up to 120 square meters, because that depends, because they were designed for very large families. In any case, that is roughly the price as it were, to buy the subsidized rent for life. And what happens is the new tenant pays the old tenant and begins, and using the financial assistance center, the new tenant becomes part of the family of the old tenant. So there's a kind of family book, which the new tenant becomes a member. Because that's very important, because the financial assistance center is responsible for this. And the IACP, they're not stupid, they know exactly what's happening. And therefore they've decided that they're not going, but all the same, in my view, they decide they're not going to interfere in this process, because otherwise it becomes very complicated. So then there's an advance deposit. So the new tenant has to remain in the family, as it were, of the old tenant for 5 years, and then after 5 years, the old tenant leaves the family, and the new tenant becomes the only tenant, the only family member. Why do I find this very interesting? First, because it tells me very clearly that it's not necessarily true in my case, in my field area, that people can escape. There are other issues beyond the issue of conditions. Even if you don't like the district, even if you don't like the buildings, it's not necessarily that which you look within your living strategy. So your living strategies can go well beyond issues of the quality of the district. So it's a parallel social housing market. So what we see is a kind of secondary alternative market, which is quite remarkable. And it goes in a completely opposite direction of disadvantaged estates where people cannot create opportunities. And when I told you they they buy the possibility of paying a low rent. And I'm talking about families with very, very low incomes, like 300 euros a month for a whole family. Sometimes 250 euros, even 150 euros. So these people with very, very low incomes. So for them, having a middle class, the possibility of buying a very low rent possibility of 100, 150 a month is a way of guaranteeing a living balance. In other words, in order to access to amenities, to possibilities like having a car, having a TV, having a mobile phone, having help with the children. They choose to live alongside their family, the original family. And it's no accident that you therefore find 7 or 8, 9 apartments with the same family. So often you have mothers with children. They're all responsible for looking after the children and for managing the house. Having grandmothers, having sisters, having aunts. It's an important thing for them, especially for managing the house, for organizing if somebody leaves, if you have children. So for the organizing your life, it's a very important factor. And that's what I mean, that's how a parallel market can emerge. And I told you about this because 2 months ago they stopped the system, a few months ago, not 2 months ago. And in fact, I wrote an email to the mayor of Naples, you really mustn't interrupt this mechanism because you don't know what's going to happen. Because when they decided to demolish that building, these buildings are occupied. They decided to knock down these buildings, and they built some new apartment buildings nearby 10 years ago, so they're in fairly bad condition themselves. But this parallel market, he couldn't know. Those new apartments were already in the parallel market. They were already sold, or as it were, the rents were already sold. So interrupting this dynamic meant some people losing money, some other people losing the right to a home, and for others to have members of their families scattered around different buildings, which a situation that has arisen in many cases recently, and that's a real worry. And this is something where local politicians have started to work on. So in the local elections, they start to work on the fact that they could resolve the problems of families. In fact, they don't have that possibility. And now, a few weeks ago, it kind of blew up like a bomb, this problem, because people go on to declare that the city was giving apartments to Camoristes. It wasn't Camoristes, it was families who already lived there. Camoristes? Camorra is the mafia. So it was said that the city was giving houses to the Camorra, to the mafia. I'm not going to go into the details. It's not the mafia, but it's sort of organized crime. Because this district is a kind of symbol of the Camorra, a symbol of the mafia. Even though it's not really true, that's part of the rhetoric of stigma. So that's what I want to tell you. Thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation. So after this presentation, I'm an architect. I don't know if I'm exactly a researcher. That's just a matter of qualification. It's an academic issue, which means that I've become a sort of researcher by accident. So when I became an architect, it took me a while to decide where I was going to work, how I was going to work with whom. So that's why I began to work on fairly distant terrains, such as Hanoi. And I've also become interested in anthropology by combining certain lessons at La Villette, comme Christine Robin, who was the founder of the Laboratory of Architecture and anthropology. And I would also like to go back to this issue of between spaces, which we'll probably talk about in the conclusion to this day. This term of between spaces, between blocks, for me, the first occurrence comes from La Villette, from something I heard the Villette from a teacher who I actually replaced there by accident, Professor Chin, who for a long time was the teacher of Métropole Asie-Pacifique at the school. And it was she who first raised the issues with students and was always very generous in passing on her knowledge. She never published in her own name. So I would like to attribute this term of between blocks to her and many other things. And I would like to... and he started talking about blocks in Hanoi, and I can't remember what era it was. My history with Hanoi began in 96, 97, but really in 1999, 2000, for the field work I did in situ, and we talked yesterday of how you conduct surveys, and I'd like to specify that Hanoi was a long field work for me. I spent almost a year there. And I returned in 2002, 2003, 2006 briefly, and very recently for this colloquium in 2017 to see how things have developed. So that's my history with Hanoi. Hanoi, to finish, is also something of a foundational space in this research project, for me at least, on the between the blocks topic, because it was there where I started to ask myself what architects could do in such spaces. Given the degree of creativity you find amongst residents, what role architects could play? Was it necessary? How should we respond or interpret to what is happening there, which is entirely outside the norms that we experience, for example, in collective housing in France? So, Hanoi, like Ulaanbaatar, is in a country which was long associated with the development of the Soviet Union and also of China, Maoist China. It's a country which came late to modernity, which led it to completely destroy its territorial and cultural fabric and its rural structure, in order to concentrate peasants and animal breeders in new cities and towns. So I'd like to go back first, look first at the territory of Hanoi and its tropical conditions. Hanoi is one of those cities which is situated between the Tropic of Capricorn and the Tropic of Cancer. And the tropical condition is a notion that was theorized by the botanist Francis Allais. What's important for me is to emphasize the particular relation with a very fertile nature, a nature that's very present and sometimes dangerous. And population groups, here we have an extract from the work of Pierre Vaux, who shows that the organization and the scattering, the entire use of the plain area of the north of Vietnam, there's been a transition from an agrarian culture focusing on rice growing, a territory where the city of Hanoi, which is 1,000 years old, was founded, but which appears in particular in the West in history with the colonization movement. It's a colonization process that was one of the first effects of modernity. It also explains this particular tropical condition, since many of the countries in this area from the middle of the 19th century were invaded by the Western powers and became areas of exploitation. So that was the case for Hanoi. And it's no accident, this is not unimportant when you want to understand the genesis of the city and what is going on today. So what we have here are images that date from the colonial period, a plan which is a sort of master plan. It's not an existing plan, it's kind of an empty plan. So all the elements that you can see on the screen on the left-hand side. Can't do it. I'll try again later. So this from 1895, sorry, you can see that Hanoi formed around from the end of the 18th, the beginning of the 19th century, around a citadel where the palace was. So when the French conquered the city, it was no longer a capital, it was just a big market. Having been named the capital of the East to differentiate it from the capital of the West, which was the city of... I can see the cursor now.
Donc, la citadelle,
where the cursor is, the seat of central power, rebuilt in the style of earlier citadels, the district, the trader district, and in that era, the colonial project was not yet in place. The citadel had not been fully dismantled, and the districts are simply projected or planned. So the colonial urban project would develop essentially in this part here, the Badin district, and south of that district. And then in the south, this district, occupied in particular by Chinese residents, occupants who come from southern China and been there for hundreds of years. Since Vietnam was for a long time linked to China, and China was both a model and an antidote. So what's important to point out is largely the writings of Philippe Papin, who was a historian, philologist, something of an anarchist, which I quite like myself. In the writings of Philippe Papin, he explains that, and this is quite rare even in cities in Southeast Asia, there is no representation of working-class Hanoi architecture before the middle of the 18th century. We have representations and we have descriptions of some buildings, official buildings, produced by the elites, in particular the Temple of Literature, which is an identical copy of the Temple of Confucius in Corfu. There are descriptions of certain buildings which belong to Mandarins, but the city that was long built of materials like bamboo and wood, we can see in the studies of Purmuru or in the Red River Delta, we can still see that most of working-class habitat housing, right up to the beginning of the Second World War, entirely consisted entirely of non-durable materials like bamboo and wood. So it's difficult to imagine what Hanoi was like. What I can say is that Hanoi, like many cities, operated, as we can see quite clearly on this plan. It was above all a city, hydraulic city, with water running through it, and with ponds, with lakes, with rivers, and with villages that produced their own craft products, and which it was a country which, or the villages, fed the main market, which was Hanoi, and in particular center, and the district of 36 streets where the Chinese and Vietnamese traders lived. So we have no representation. I'm specifying that because it has been argued that, and we'll work on that question again, that there is a certain kind of concept of making the city which is very difficult to grasp, in particular in Vietnam, and to try to rediscover elements of hybrid architecture or reference which in fact no longer really exist. So the second image, the images you can see on the right come from a book published in the 1930s, in 1929, which show perhaps certain invariant elements, certain recurrent elements, and in particular that of the economy of street merchants, street traders, who were always tolerated in the city of Hanoi but never really accepted. In any case, not really authorized. In the colonial era, there were already not exactly an attempt to remove, but at least a control over these street traders, and this accelerated with the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. And continued after. So here's a kind of layout of this tropical condition, which covers, which encompasses several dimensions. Very few representations of so-called traditional architecture, Vietnamese architecture before the 19th, 20th century. On the top left, a view of the 36th Street district, which had canals running through it and was a fairly closed district, which is not without significance when we talk about gated districts, security protection in today's world. And another view from below, which is now in the 1930s, 1940s. This is the first image comes from the early 20th century. In the second, it's the 1930s, 1940s. And here again we can see this famous model of the Chinese compartment, which I'll say a couple of words about. It's a form of construction which you can find everywhere in Southeast Asia and comes from southern China. And in fact, it's fairly common in other countries, since in fact it's characteristic to combine ground floor commercial activity or craft work in the courtyards with housing. So a combination of commerce and housing on fairly small plots which develop in length, in longitudinally. And here again I'm showing this image because we've also sometimes identified in these between the block situations a kind of resurgence of compartments, a retranscription of compartments, extensions on bars, on blocks. It's perhaps a matter of chance, and it's perhaps this measure that keeps recurring, this extension of the block. Hanoi was planned by the French, and not completely finished. You can see this on the right, that's 1943. So I'll go quite quickly to another view of Hanoi, which is not produced by the Vietnamese, by the Vietnamese Army Mapping Service. So that reflects the moment when the first collective housing districts were produced. So I'd like to specify how the project of modernity was imposed and developed in Vietnam. In the middle of the 1950s, in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, in North Vietnam. So this is the era when there was a North Vietnam and South Vietnam. The economic situation changed. First, while the rural economy was mainly based on rice production, on intensive rice production. Labor was mobilized there. By contrast with other countries, the new Vietnamese rural economy neglected industrial production. Labor was organized at two different levels, so it was a collectivist economy. In families and village communities, there are the two forms. From 1955, the young of North Vietnam established state farms and peasant collectives. The aim was to control and increase agricultural production by developing the collective level to manage activities, traditional type activities, while at the state modernizing the process, modernizing agriculture, mechanization, use of chemical fertilizers. From 1955 to 65, the family continued a non-organized form of production and was nevertheless fairly free to pursue this. From 1966 onwards, and that's what interests us, and the start of the US bombing of Hanoi, the state had to go against its ideology. The effort of industrialization, previously concentrated in Hanoi, moved to the countryside. Hanoi began to be evacuated, and people were moved out of the city, and the town became more rural. And during the period of bombing, the agriculturalization of the society developed. In 1975, at the time of reunification, Hanoi had nobody in it, and the city became emptier and emptier, and as people moved to the country. So previously, the city was considered as a kind of pro-communist bloc, as you had in Ulaanbaatar. So the city was previously perceived as a place for the realization of the socialist dream. In Vietnam, the city was, for a very long time, considered by the new directors, and I quote of the new political leaders, as the place of the fiefdom of the haute bourgeoisie and the rich. So what we have is a major political and economic change, and here we see propaganda posters which illustrate what I've just explained. An injunction to produce more in the country, and while promoting the dismantlement of the family economy, which is the paradox of the propaganda and policy. On the left, we have a poster which explains that buffalo will be fatter, will be better. On the right, you have a poster which makes the apology of cooperation with Russia. You have the Soviet flag, so this is for construction. This is a bit later, for the construction of the Wabin Dam, which was supposed to supply Hanoi with electricity, and they explain with the cooperation with Russia is a matter of joy and happiness. And it shouldn't be forgotten there was a war between 66 and 75 against the US, and here you have a poster that explains that every roof must become a fortress against the US. The roofs are the roofs in the 36th Street district. But the KTT are what are called the collective housing sectors. So here we have a Life magazine poster on Hanoi, which dates 1967, and it was precisely at this time the effort to produce collective housing began in the mid-1950s, but became more intense at the beginning of the 1960s, and didn't decline even during the US bombing. And bombing affected life in the countryside, peasant life. As I explained, many families returned to the countryside in order to escape the bombing. And Hanoi, according to this US journalist, appeared serene on the surface, but is an anxious city. But was nevertheless planning a number of collective districts. And now you'll see again what we saw yesterday, which is the micro-district. I won't go back over the organization, the layout, which is similar, the same question of 500 meters, amenities and services. There are several phases of construction. I'm not going to go back to that question since we saw that there were certain recurrences from one country to another. It's linked both with a way of organizing society, but also a way of producing buildings that involved further industrialization of housing production, including the use of prefabricated elements. And there's also a change of scale. As we saw yesterday, buildings were increasingly far away from each other. Again, the buildings are bigger. If we start with unities like we had buildings where there was a space between blocks of 20 meters or so. In Tan Xuan, the buildings are much bigger and reveal a change of both scale and construction methods. On the right, you can see what some people have called the sprawl of the collective housing districts, the KTT, the spread, which for some people formed a red belt around Hanoi, a whole concept, a kind of imaginary regarding a protective belt. And I was particularly interested, I worked in particular on one of them, which is Kim Il-yen, which is in red. I say quickly, this part of the city, which is behind the wall and therefore invisible from the rest of the city, is now called the Futen district. We can look at the plans, but again, we can see that the model is identical. It's replicated identically. As Philippe Papin explained in an article, it's that Vietnamese are picked up models without necessarily changing them. Same with China, they're perhaps more modern than us. So there are very few adaptations, despite what people have said. Those who've been to the École des Beaux-Arts in Hanoi, the model was essentially unchanged. It's applied absolutely the same. These collective housing districts and the blocks of which they're made. So this is one district during its construction in the 1980s. And then Kim Il-yen was built south of the Donda district, in the inner suburbs of Hanoi, which had been a rice-growing area, an agricultural area, was therefore considered empty space. There were no villages or buildings there. This district was planned. This is which dates back to 1911. We can see the village of Kim Il-yen. So the district was built in near the village of Kim Il-yen. And there we can see the usual kind of network of ponds and canals and rivers. So this kind of embankment street. So the collective part would be built on a flood zone, and which would be drained. So this is a district from 1986, a district already finished. Originally it's stretched, in fact it's still stretched over 40 hectares or so, intended for 100,000 people, both workers and management classes. So there were, when I worked there were more than 22,000 inhabitants, and now perhaps more. But the number of inhabitants has become stable. A few images here of Kim Il-yen in the 1980s, before
les changements et les transformations.
the changes and transformations.
Voici un plan que
Here's
j'ai
a
réalisé
plan
on parlait des sources
that I produced myself. We talked about sources yesterday. It's impossible to obtain sources in Hanoi, so a lot of the plans were done with just a few documents.
Donc, Kim Yen, c'était ce village qui était
was this
spécialisé
village which
notamment dans le
specialized
textile. Aujourd'hui,
in
on retrouve
textiles,
cette activité avec
and
les
you
filles.
still find this activity with the
Et
rag
Kim Yen
trade.
est un quartier important parce que
Kim Yen is an important district because,
Tsaoyan Sinkun,
like Tsaoyan Sinkun,
c'est un peu l'archétype des
it's a
KTT,
bit the archetype of collective housing districts in Hanoi.
comme je dis, reprennent
It's
la question
KTT,
du
they're called.
micro-rayon.
And they take up the concept of the micro-district with a housing unit
Donc,
called a tikku.
1985,
So in 1985,
justement,
here are the different
les différents ensembles qui constituent le micro-rayon.
buildings that constitute the micro-district.
Je ne vais pas entrer
I
dans les
won't go over it in
détails.
detail.
2000, pardon.
Now we're in
On
2000.
voit, les extensions,
We
c'est
can see the
assez frappant,
extensions,
c'est ce
which
qui
is
m'avait
quite
frappé en
striking.
premier, mais
This is
justement,
what struck me first,
cette façon de faire la ville,
but in fact this way of making the city,
rapidement décrire
which I will describe
cette façon de
quickly,
transformer
this way of
le
transforming the
quartier,
district
semblait qu'une partie
seemed
émergée de ce qui se passait plus profondément.
just the tip of the
Notamment ce qui se
iceberg.
passait en termes de recomposition
So
et
what was going on beneath the
d'organisation,
surface was a form of recomposition, a reorganization, a rearrangement of groups within blocks and groups between blocks. And there was a working group, as in China, and many things are managed either at individual building level or within clusters of buildings. And this organization continued in certain cases and failed in others. So it's interesting to see where it worked and where it didn't work, how things were rearranged and what impact it had on the transformations of the district.
Bref,
in short,
présentation des relevés qui ont été un support
a presentation of the surveys that were very important for me, seen from the outside, which were linked with interviews, discussions with some of the inhabitants. These are surveys I did in several buildings, but as you can see, the footprint of one of these standard blocks, you can see the footprint, and you can see the extensions which vary in size on the ground floor. We can explain what's happened. Here are views which are important for me, this work in the interiors, for understanding the different fragments that could be seen, which is either an individual culture or a shared culture. So there's a real balance between individual desirs and this kind of collective community awareness, which means that for a time, and a time when the political and economic conditions made it possible, extensions developed and the residents developed what really concerned themselves. How much time have I got? 5 minutes? Less than 5 minutes, okay. This photographic work, which we can return to later, we can do the same thing as Philippe Paneret did yesterday on Cairo. We can explain many things on the basis from these photos, how the extensions were developed, how the between spaces and courtyards were formed. What's important is there was an effort to plant trees and vegetation alongside the extensions, which at the same time gave this appearance to a certain district of collective housing. It has to be said that these extensions are present in all the collective districts in Hanoi, which is quite impressive because there are perhaps 30 big housing estates in Hanoi, perhaps in all 40 operations, with a few blocks, smaller operations, but everywhere, absolutely everywhere, we can see these extensions, these use of in-between spaces, this diversity, the shops installed on ground floor areas in relation to what's going on inside and around the blocks. As we saw the article we talked about yesterday, so here, once again, it seems a bit risky to talk about architectural models. I think once again, at a given moment, there's a real need to to push the walls, push the envelope, and to take over what really directly concerns residents. And there was the transition in 1986 from the planned economy to the liberal economy, market socialism, and the disengagement of the state from the management of these estates, which meant that while maintaining relations with the Popular Committee, the People's Committee, which is also directly linked with the Communist Party in the districts. It's those discussions between inhabitants and between housing units which made it possible to adjust and to construct another city, which, despite everything, despite the fact that it was working, from the end of the 1990s, was disqualified, was negatively perceived by central power, by government, by a number of the elites. And in fact, they were sometimes described as vertical slums in Hanoi to describe these modifications and extensions of the housing estates. So I'll finish. What's important for us, here we have an overview of the estate. What's important for us is this time when everything seemed possible. Stop came to an end when policies changed in the mid-1980s, and they shifted to a new way of producing housing with public-private partnership and the impossibility for these inhabitants who had become owners of the right to use their apartments de facto, and the loss of their capacity to act on their own residential spaces. So, all these inhabitants had previously produced something unique in their estates. They became sort of entrepreneur, and they began to conduct a form of predatory activity on land with an organization, resales, a kind of speculation on land. So this time came to an end, and today, and in the last few years already, the estates have been under threat, and some of the blocks have already been changed, modified. Nguyen Kum Tung, who is an architect who argues in favor for homeopathic treatment of the estates. So what we're seeing are projects that to either work directly on the estates or nearby. So, for example, the Hanoi Fair was demolished. So this has the effect on the residents who are still present or in condominium to oblige them to sell, and therefore affects a shift towards a new type of district production. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So, thank you. I'd like to give my thanks to Philippe Panare, who presented some photos of Cairo and its districts. As Philippe Panare is modest, he forgot to say that following him, many students have worked on this district, and that's the case for me since I began visiting this estate in 1993, the last century, as part of my geography thesis. With work on regular work, I returned pretty much every year until 2005. In 2005, I joined forces with my colleague, Florence Troin, as part of an A&R on research on space and uses, which enabled us to carry out several assignments to continue our interviews, to see people we'd already met in the 1990s. And Florence, for her part, has conducted numerous systematic photographic campaigns. She must be friends with half the kids in the city, in the estate. But she's also done a map, a cartography, and here you can see some photos. I had the opportunity to return to the estate in 2012, and then again in 2017, in order to continue this work over a long period, to go back to the same parts of the estate, the same blocks, to see the same people, and once again, perhaps with a prejudice, a presupposition I had in the 1990s, that nothing changed. And as both with Florence and more recently, I realized that there are changes, there are differences, and that's what I want to show you. So we're going to emphasize 3 points in introducing this work. The first is that, as we can already see in this photo, we are looking at a type of urbanism which is imposed by those who, in principle, are supposed to make the city. In other words, professionals of the city, urbanists, architects, planners, decision makers, etc. This is the model of the big social housing estate of the kind that was built in the 1950s and 60s in France, and which was exported in that era in a standardized form to southern countries, in this case, Cairo. In France, at that era, we could see that the estate was both isolated and peripheral. It was isolated because it was bounded to the west by the informal area of the tannery, where none of the estate residents went. Then there was the peripheral road to the south, and then the north, an aqueduct, where with fairly limited access under certain arches. So it's both isolated and peripheral. So that's how the estate was developed. So building began in 1958. The source of Sira consisted of 150 blocks, which were called blocats in the Egyptian dialect. Broadly 5,000 dwellings for 30 to 35,000 inhabitants. Originally, the planners had planned for wide roads and public spaces, all the amenities needed for a big area, a big estate. So now we can see here how gradually the people who lived there rejected the plans, as it were, in order to paraphrase Henri Lefebvre. So in order to explain this a bit further, because what's interesting is the connection between the social and the spatial, we need to talk about a date which constituted a rupture, a break, which we found in many of the presentations yesterday, and it's not specific to Cairo, a rupture which was the possibility of home ownership. The inhabitants were initially tenants from 58 to 1969. And in 1969, it became possible for them to buy their own apartments. And it's this ownership status that gave them the possibility to, as it were, demonstrate their talents as builders in order to transform the original built space. What we can say about this change of status of occupancy is the fact of being an owner, and in fact this is perhaps slightly different from what was said yesterday. The fact of being an owner does not entail an individualization of practices and withdrawal into oneself, but in fact developed logics of sociability and community. In fact, the idea was to share the public spaces adjacent to housings, which required negotiations, discussions, and shared management of these adjacent spaces. As Françoise Boucheron said, who has worked a lot on adjacent spaces as part of her work as a on planning. This shared management of public spaces sometimes obliges people to establish social relations that could extend to conflict and established social relations between families and neighbors. So please let me a little aside on adjacent spaces. What do I mean by adjacent spaces? Perhaps for some of us that's obvious, but not for everybody. An adjacent space is the adjacent space between the public and the private, the interface between the inside and the outside. It's the linked space, the connected space, a space which is both between something and common to two things. It's what brings together and what separates. It relates to opening and closing. It's what can be inside the residence and outside the residence. It can be what people try to mask and what tries to show, notably for inhabitants of the ground floor, or what people want to hide. Hide doesn't necessarily mean to close. And here it refers to the position of women. These adjacent spaces are intermediate spaces of visibility. And we'll see what we particularly struck us was the presence of women who would approach us, who would ask us if we wanted to come inside and get a tea, or told us perhaps to go and look at the pyramids. So this perhaps challenges a prejudice that women are hidden and masked by these systems, which is not at all the case. There are also men at their windows, in addition, and children in the street. The third point, it seems to us that beyond housing, apart from the micro-production of space that we're going to talk about, it contributes to the making of the city, and a particularly strong emblem for this kind of estate. So perhaps we can go back on these photos. The strategy of building, this ability to invent, to adapt habitat to their needs, this micro-appropriation of space together makes this estate somewhat different. And we can see from all the photos we've seen that this is not unique to this estate. However, these micro-productions are never perceived as skills or an art of doing things, neither by outsiders like architects and urbanists, but no more, in fact, by the inhabitants themselves. So even though they recognize that their extensions are useful, they may claim that through their proliferation, the image of the estate will be no different from an informal district. And that's something they worry about, in fact, to be confused with a kind of slum. So in fact, these little arrangements of space need to be associated with a history that goes back some 50 years and to socioeconomic changes which have affected these inhabitants. And so all these parameters are correlated with what we have defined as several successive time frames. The first time frame, which emerged from our interviews, particularly with older people who still live in the estate, the first time frame was 1960s. I said earlier that it was the tenants of these estates who were young couples who arrived with children, young children, and mostly belonged to the middle classes. That middle class was the class on which NASA depended, who would house this middle class, not the poorest people, but this middle class who were his supporters. So these first arrivals moved into new houses, new apartments, well-made, new, offering hope. And it can be said that this settlement corresponded for them to a kind of a residential promotion, advancement. A residential advancement that for this class would represent a kind of social advancement as well. since they benefited from a whole set of Nasser's laws, which involve minimum wage, social security, education for older children. And that explains that these inhabitants had a kind of protected status, who were kind of somewhat spoilt by Nasser's regime. And that explains why they have a degree of nostalgia for the 1960s, which is very strong. So what they say is that everything was fine until the 1960s, until the social degradation of the 1970s. So it's at that time where the first little arrangements with space took place, internal transformations of spaces, but also external transformations with the closing of the balconies and loggias, which we've seen in other estates in other places, and also the closing of the balconies and the loggia, which increased the internal area to make a small room, and then the opening up of further windows in the facades. As you can see, these windows were not there originally because they are arranged to reflect people's desires and needs. The second time frame, as we said earlier, it's the point of rupture in 1969 when the status of the residents changed and they had the possibility to own their own apartments. What we saw then was a development of extensions, and we could see how those extensions would be consolidated over time. Initially, it shouldn't be hidden. This led to intervention by the authorities, and some of them were demolished. But nevertheless, all the inhabitants of the estate, priestesses, because as one man explained, all the inhabitants who more or less transformed, since pretty much everybody had made changes, they couldn't attack everybody. So we tried to decipher some of these changes. It's not always easy. They're linked with the change in the demographic context, which need to be linked with a housing market that was saturated. So in order to counter this saturation, and as everywhere children were growing, as far as possible, the girls had to be separated from boys, and then the married couple, so you need to build extensions for them, because those young couples could not necessarily find their own place to live. So in an anticipatory strategy, people began to create rooms to anticipate the marriage of their children. And nobody minds growth. So people's abilities to expand their dwellings varied, and of course this was particularly to the disadvantage of the middle stories. If you live on the top story, there's no problem. You just take the advantage of building a staircase and an extra floor on the roof. So we tried to do a survey of these vertical extensions. So on the cartographic work, we concentrated on the 21 blocks, and we did a fair number of work on those. And if people who lived on the ground floor, as we can see, you can extend into the street or even occupy or recover stairwells, which, as you can see, we have identified here, which is fairly widespread activity. So some people are obviously better placed than others, which in fact masks the phenomenon of additions when seen from a distance. So what we see is some very diverse residential strategies and challenges that lead to fairly disparate practices, different use of different materials based on people's incomes. So by going back to the field in 2005, the idea was to look to see what had changed, see if anything had changed. And in fact, what seemed quite obvious to us and quite spectacular from the beginning of this century, in the third time frame, is both the consolidation and collective constructions, which we thought were interesting in several respects. Here on the slide you can see you have an extension which is built by a single tenant. We talked with the residents. What we can see is an extension, a vertical extension. And they explained that, first of all, these collective extensions made it possible to negotiate more advantageous prices with contractors and save money. But in addition, they were better built, they were stronger and more durable. And in fact, some of the small individual extensions were demolished and rebuilt better like this, with a degree of differentiation. Not all the balconies are cut in the same way. So there were still individual choices, but the approach was collective, which made this kind of extension possible. So these expectations, these extensions took the form of collective funds, which were used for the repair and maintenance of these extensions, because access to ownership for the inhabitants was concomitant with this disengagement of the state, which was badly received by the inhabitants, which was seen as a betrayal of social housing policy. This is an expression for Anne Gutmann in France. So it's always a betrayal of social housing policy. So the fact is that as owners, they obtain greater freedom of action, greater freedom of appropriation, greater freedom to transform their homes. But on the other hand, they regret the presence of the state, the original estate, and who maintain the public spaces. In fact, the collective organizations that followed were necessary to replace the state. These collective extensions were a fact, but unfortunately, things were not quite as rosy as that. For people who lacked resources, were unable to participate in these collective extensions, and that poses a problem, as you can see from this first photo on the left. A problem resolved quite quickly, since, as you can see, when we came by a year later, you can see that the empty space has been filled in with brick, and the resident has managed to transform that space into a room, and obviously having repaid their neighbors for the work undertaken. In certain cases, unfortunately, as you can see the photo on the left, in 2008 and 2017, nothing has changed. And you can imagine what that means if you live on the ground floor and you have these kind of pillars in front of your window, which mean that the room that gave onto the street is complete without light. So all these pillars we identified, and I counted, there are 17 of them, and in 21 blocks, so one per block. So as you can see, as we saw in Hanoi, extensions which are in black compared with the original blocks. And therefore it's quite easy to see a recurrent pattern. In the north-south buildings, i.e. the vertical buildings, you can only see that these extensions are only found on the rear facade, the eastern facade, which is because on the other facades you have the entry halls which cannot be covered. However, on the eastern facade it's much easier. Conversely, on the vertical buildings, in other words, oriented east-west, which consist of apartments which only had one room inside, we very quickly understood that people on both sides of the buildings had each built extensions, which in fact is represented by these black additions on the top of the building. And in this case, the stairway is of little importance. Another way of representing this coverage of the facades, you can see again the difference between the west and eastern facades. And here represented by little fives, the number of levels the number of floors of extensions, you can see that it's quite considerable. So another way of looking at it, block 6, 83% of the surface covered. So the fourth time frame, just to say something, in this zone we have no example. In other parts of the estate, the extensions, these one-room extensions, the one-room apartments, so substantial that you can no longer see the original block. So I'm going to go through the activity dimension. As you can see, these adjacent spaces in the 1970s, economic situation was difficult. So there was a period when some of the people would move politically in favor of Nasser, in favor of the Muslim Brotherhood. It was a difficult era. This time, the wages of civil servants were not sufficient for families. Hence, you see a proliferation of small shops and kiosks on the ground floors with shops and different kinds of economic activities. And then you see a ground floor residence that now has a double function, both as a home and as a little shop. So these activities were not entirely legal, but they were kind of tolerated in a context of economic uncertainty. So just an example on this transformation linked with economic conditions. You can see the Coca-Cola fridge in this example. 2007, 2008, we don't see any great change between 2007 and 2008. But now in 2009, we still have the Coca-Cola fridge, but we can see the extension above it. And then we'll go over gardens. Obviously, we talked about it. Gardens are a particularly interesting space because, again, it's adjacent. There are two types of garden. There's the private garden for people living on the ground floor, which is a kind of screen, a protecting family intimacy, particularly at meal times, because it's preferable to hide what you're eating. These gardens also limit the face-to-face relations, so they have a kind of aesthetic function. And then there are collective gardens, which are larger, obviously created and maintained by and for all the inhabitants within a single block, which therefore become meeting places, siesta places, as Bénédicte specifies, so no doubt she took advantage of them, and for children to play. And so places of spatial and social coexistence, which therefore require agreement and negotiation between neighbors, but they're also territorial markers to protect from a potentially invasive population, especially from the tannery district that we mentioned earlier, the informal district. We said earlier that from the 2000s onwards, what we saw through this observational work and photos with Florence is the emergence of practice of distinction, of beautification, of embellishment, which are much more obvious than previously. So this embellishment can be seen through the use of different materials, diverse materials, and also care taken with the finish, with tiling, with painting, with wood slats, balconies, for example. For example, here, ways of doing things that were individual, which also show a way of communicating socially, an expression of social status. An example that interests us a lot, as you can see, in 2007 and 2008. Mark the text. The owner baptized it as a chateau. He called it a chateau, which is at the foot of the block, which shows some fairly careful work by the owner. On 2016, the chateau is still there, 2017, and the block now has an additional floor at the top, which is very visible. Here are some further ways of distinguishing your home: the private staircase, allowing people to enter their home through the back. So these are all the private stairways at the back. The almost systematic use of grills to close the entry hall. And here's then what's called a disappropriation, a negative disappropriations in terms of maintenance, the deterioration, accumulation of waste, which explains the impossibility of collective management and reflects the disengagement of the state. And these disappropriations lead to situations that are quite critical here: a shrinking of the street. And after a time, the street becomes completely impossible. So to conclude, in 1 minute, 4 points. As we can see in an overview, or seen from Google Earth, these are practices that are apparently disordered, not rationalized. But through mapping, through cartography, we can see constants emerging. There are shared norms between the inhabitants. What we can also see is that after these 2 days of examples, we can see attitudes to creativity, to invention, to innovation. But how is this transmitted? In fact, we find that interviews are essential in order to understand how people imitate and emulate each other, the exchanges of knowledge, which necessarily employ neighborhood relations and social networks. If we don't understand these relations between neighbors, we'll never understand how people make and do things and how they talk about them. And that we were able to verify because we can see that we have examples of social degradation. So we see an isolation. So we can't say that everybody manages to resolve conflicts. There are situations where that doesn't happen. Second point. We have a kind of imposed architecture, which is apparently quite rigid, quite restrictive. But in fact, and paradoxically, we are convinced that this urban model provides an architecture that is smooth and flexible. It is because these public spaces are quite large that these forms of appropriation are possible. They would be impossible in more dense fabrics. So we can see a great deal of flexibility in these spaces, a malleability, a plasticity, a kind of polysemy of uses and functions. So these are resource spaces where people can kind of experiment with materials and social meanings and differences. Not forgetting perhaps something that we haven't spoken about much, which is the emotional dimension. What do people think about what they do? And that's the question that I asked yesterday morning, and which needs to be explored. The third point, the inhabitants have understood this malleability of space. They have internalized it. And we can also see in other examples of housing, social housing estates, more recent in Cairo, the same processes at work. We can see the transformation of balconies, of hallways. We can even extrapolate by imagining something similar in our own big estates. Whatever you say, though, these adjacent spaces are places of experimentation, places of testing ways of living together and living differently. And then we come to the political dimension. We talked about the changes in policy in the state, but this is more general. I think that there's a kind of downgrading of these types of housing we see elsewhere, which are often a kind of isolated or decentered location, a sense of abandonment by the state. And this situation obviously allows transformations, but does not prevent a sense of exclusion. We have had the example of heritage of personal assets. This particular estate is particularly badly viewed by the Egyptian authorities, so it's not as if people had appreciating assets. And then finally, the adjacent tannery slum district, informal district, is going to be is covered by an urban development program. It's going to be ultra liberal, which will be adjacent to the estate, and there are questions we can ask ourselves about the future of this estate, which will be next to a new super high status polar new estate. Thank you very much.